Hi everyone, this is Dave, East Rosebud Fly and Tackle in Billings, Montana. Today I'm going to tie for you a dry fly called a Quigley Cripple. This was created by the late Bob Quigley, and it may very well have been the first dry fly to imitate an emerger. The idea for the Quigley is we're using water absorbent material, here marabou for the tail, dubbing for the body, deer hair and hackle. This fly actually sits on the water like this, so it replicates an emerging insect. When I think about four species or four types of mayflies we have in our area that have a difficult time emerging, and what I mean by that, there's a lot of cripples, there's a lot of stillborns. One is the western green drake, which I'll tie for you today. Another one is the western March brown. They also have a difficult time emerging, and simply a matter of swapping colors of materials, marabou, abdomen, hackle, the color of the deer hair. Another one is our PMD, which is a summertime hatcher. It's a little smaller fly. Just use a lighter bleached deer hair for the wing. And the last is the Baetis, or the blue-winged olives, and typically they hatch when it's cold, cloudy, and rainy, and you can have a high number of stillborns and cripples with that species as well. So those are the four flies that I think about when I think about tying the Quigley Cripple. So we're going to do a western green drake, and I'm using the fire hole number 419, size 12. It's a dry fly hook. It's a 2 extra wide gap, which I really like. It's a light wire hook, nickel finished, extremely sharp. I really like these hooks. And I'm using 6/0 Vivas thread, an olive color. Going to start the thread behind the eye, and we're going to build a simple thread base all the way to the back. Now, as you know, most mayfly patterns use tailing material that helps to support the fly on the surface. With a Quigley Cripple, we're using something that is water absorbent. Now we want small, dense fibers. I'm simply using a piece of PMD colored or olive. This is the prime marabou, not the blood quill. And I'm just going to isolate. We need a pretty good clump since we're only going to be using the very, very tips. Isolate about a good 1.5 inch fibers here, and simply tear them off. And then we'll condense and collect this. We want a tail that's about hook shank in length, which is standard for dry flies. So we measure that and tie it down. We want to tie this forward to about the 70% point to keep our abdomen taper consistent. When we get there, we'll take off the butts. Now, if your marabou tails end up being a little longer than you wanted them, simply a matter of pinching them off. Don't cut them off with your scissors. You lose a lot of the effect. So we have a nice little shank length tail. Now, the western March brown is a distinctly, western green drake is a distinctly segmented fly. So we're going to use some yellow floss here for segmentation. I'll tie that in here where my thread is hanging, bring it to the far side of the hook, and tie it down to my tail. Now I'm going to bring my thread forward to the middle because I'll apply some dubbing next. And I'm just using some olive hair tron. Just about any dubbing will work. This is just rabbit fur with some synthetic fiber. We want to keep this very thin. We don't have much abdomen to dub here. And the reason I brought my thread to the middle of the hook is because it's about impossible to dub tightly right up against the hook shank. This way, instead of wrapping bare thread at the tail of the hook and building up bulk, I can bring my dub thread back and have my dubbing start right where I want it. And we're just going to build a slightly tapered body, again back up to the 70% point on the hook. like so. So you see we're about at the 70% point, and then I'm going to get my floss and twist it so that it's nice and tight, nice and thin, and just make just a couple of wraps forward over the dubbed abdomen. With the March Brown, I do the same thing, but with a brown 3/0 thread, because that fly is heavily segmented, and we'll snip off the excess. All right, now we want to bring our thread back to about the 50% point to make sure we've covered that abdomen so we don't have any gaps. And we're going to use some peacock herl for about half of the thorax. I'm just going to take about 4 or 5 herls off of an eyed stick. Even up the tips reasonably well. Cut off about 1 inch of the tips of this. Tips of peacock herl is too fine. If you tie it in and try to wrap it, they'll break on you just about every time. So we'll tie in the tips of our peacock herl, bring our thread back to where we tied it in, and to reinforce it, I'm simply bringing the herl straight down and wrapping it clockwise around the thread just a couple of times, because we're only going to have room to make a couple of wraps here. So with our peacock and our thread together, I'll just make 2 wraps here, allow the peacock to unwind from the thread, and then tie the peacock down. Okay, so again, I only wrapped about half of the thorax. We need room for our wing. So the wing is made of just standard deer hair. When you tie a PMD, you'll probably want to go with bleached deer hair. They have a yellowish, lighter wing, so you want a lighter colored hair. You can also use bleached yearling elk. All right, we don't need a large amount. As always, hold it about 1/3 of the way down from the tips. Clean out the short hairs, clean out the underfur. And then we'll stack it. Where my stacker is. All right. We want our tips laying out over the eye of the hook, so I'm going to take the hair out of the stacker so that the tips are facing to the right. That way I don't have to pass it back and forth between my hands and lose my nice aligned tips. We want our wing to be shank length long, so we'll measure that here. I'm going to pinch it here. Make 2 wraps of thread, pull it down to flare it. Now don't let go of your butts. We're going to wrap our thread back a few thread wraps over the butt to make room to tie in and wrap our dry fly hackle. Try to keep your tips forward and the butts back, and just a few wraps, just enough room for our hackle. Don't worry about the tips, we'll straighten those up when we wrap the hackle. All right, for hackle, I'm just using a grizzly dyed gold and olive, which is a color I really like for this fly, and it is sized. It's a size 12 for this hook, as it should be. I'm going to strip off a little bit of the fibers from the base. I always like to strip off a couple of extra fibers from the side that's going to be first wrapped against the hook. So I have the shiny side towards me, and I'm going to tie this hackle in right where my thread is. Again, keeping the shiny side up. Take a couple of thread wraps here. Then I'm going to bring the wing up and capture the butt of the hackle stem in front of the wing and come forward. All right, make sure we have our tips forward and the butt's back. And then I'm simply going to take a few wraps of closely spaced hackle directly behind the wing. Then I'm going to bring the wing tips up, bring the hackle right to the front of the wing tips. That helps to stand them up. And take a couple of wraps of hackle there. Then we'll tie off the hackle. Looks like I got some wing tips trapped. Alright. Now clear this eye out by stroking everything back. Making a couple of wraps of thread going backwards to trap these loose hackle fibers down and to finish ahead. And you can see how that stood that wing up very nicely. Whip finish. And then the very last thing we do is we trim these butts. Gather all of the butts up. Make sure you don't have your tail material in there. Bring your scissors, and we're going to cut them right at the back of the thorax, just straight across like that. So there you have it. Quigley Cripple is a very good fly for emergent time. It will also stand a reasonable amount of rough water, so it's a good all-purpose fly. If you haven't tied a Quigley Cripple, you should. It's an excellent fly to have in your arsenal. Thanks for joining us. If you have any questions or comments, please don't hesitate to contact us. See you next time.